My plan for the talk today is as follows. First, I'll explain the reasons why I'm not a fan of the idea of the Anthropocene, which I hope won't cause you any regrets for having invited me to speak. And second, I will hone in on the issue that I found most intriguing in the debates over the Anthropocene, namely the idea that it represents the collapse or the breaching of two temporalities, more precisely the breaching of human history by deep planetary time. This formulation, I should say, before I move on to the third point, this formulation about the collapsing of two calendars comes from the work of postcolonial historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, and I'll say a bit about what leads him to these claims and the implications that he draws from them. And so then third, I'll explain why I don't accept Chakrabarty's way of framing this issue as the collapse of two calendars or temporalities. And I'll sketch out a few elements of a much messier picture of our entanglement in multiple scales of time. And then fourth, I'll illustrate these suggestions briefly with the example of evolution and extinction. And then finally, I'll suggest that we would best move forward in thinking about our entanglements in deep temporal scales by developing further the phenomenological notion of the Earth, which Chakrabarty has explicitly dismissed as irrelevant for responding to the Anthropocene challenge. So let me begin with a few preliminary remarks about the Anthropocene and why I have been reluctant to take up this concept in my own name. And I do apologize if I'm treading well-worn paths, since I'm sure that many of you already know quite a lot about these debates, but I hope that this brief sketch will help contextualize my approach to the main theme of my talk. So to start with its popular formulation, the Anthropocene is typically presented as the view that human beings have become the dominant influence on Earth systems at a planetary scale with unprecedented atmosphere, ecosystems, and biodiversity. And this is understood then to mark a radical change in the scale of our impact prior to the Anthropocene. And of course, there's a great deal of debate over where that shift occurred. Is it with the advent of fossil fuel use or colonialism or agriculture and so on? Now, this is not a radically new idea, and we can find variants of it in environmental writings across the last century. If anything, in light of the development of environmental thinking over the last 50 years, this formulation, the Anthropocene formulation, has seemed to many in the humanities and the social sciences as a bit politically naive, or even as an effort to deflect responsibility, because it locates the root of global environmental problems in anthropos, a generalized or abstract conception of humanity. And this obscures the historical, political, and economic context that has made the disruption of Earth systems possible, enriching some while destroying the lives and livelihoods of others. So this designation seems to replay a well-worn strategy of blaming human nature, thereby rationalizing and naturalizing colonial and capitalist violence. So, for example, political theorist Jeremy Baskin has summarized this point succinctly when he writes that, quote, as a concept, the Anthropocene appears overall to legitimate the dominant order, even if unintentionally, unquote. And as you probably know, an entire series of alternatives have been proposed: the Capitalocene, the Plantationocene, the Thulocene, and others. Now, alongside the popular version of the Anthropocene, it also has a formal scientific meaning. And in this context, the Anthropocene refers to the empirical claim that human beings are leaving a trace in the geological record comparable to other traces that mark the transitions between stages on the geological timescale. And when geologists agree on a reference point in rock strata that marks such a transition, they designate it as a global boundary stratotype section and point, the GSSP, colloquially termed a golden spike. But they're not always golden and they're not always spikes. But in short, the Anthropocene designation would require international agreement on the specific human-caused traces in geological strata that signal the boundary between the Holocene and the Anthropocene. And these would need to be traces that will remain legible into the far future at geological scales of time. So identifying these stratigraphic reference points, these golden spikes, this is the work of the International Commission on Stratigraphy, and they have yet to make a formal decision concerning the Anthropocene. But as you may know, they are considering a number of different reference points for this transition. The leading option right now are radionuclides from atomic bomb testing, but they're also fans of sedimentary evidence of species, extinctions and introductions, or ice cores marking climatic change, artificial technofossils from human refuse, and the like. So it's important to recognize here that the Anthropocene proposal reverses the temporal perspective from which all previous GSSP designations have been made. So rather than reconstructing events from the deep geological past, it's making predictions about the remote future. And that calls for entirely different methods and evidence than is the case with other golden spikes. So this makes the Anthropocene claim, the scientific version of the Anthropocene claim, both distinctive and controversial. And part of what's strange and provocative about this proposal is that it essentially evolves us in imagining ourselves from the perspective of a post-Anthropocene future. So for example, Stefan Strimscher puts the point this way. He says, the Anthropocene is about imagining our own fossils under the gaze of far future stratigraphers of another species or from another planet and imagining how they will remember us. I actually think that Claire Colebrook captures this point most succinctly when she writes, from the capacity to read our own inhuman past, we can imagine an inhuman future that will read our human present. Now, for a popular example of this, because you can see this as part of the Anthropocene discussions really everywhere, but for a recent popular example, consider this quote from science writer Rachel Brazil from last year in Chemistry World. She writes, if anyone is around in millions of years to examine the future geological record, they may still find the technofossils of the Anthropocene. Perhaps, says environmental scientist Neil Rose, whereas we now see, for example, an imprint of an ammonite in a rock record, we may then see an imprint of a Coke can, CD, or Lego brick. Now, this is a contentious claim among geologists, to be clear, since some of them dismiss these predictions about the legibility of our own fossil record on deep temporal scales. And I think Peter Brannon, who's a science writer, not a geologist, but who's been tracking these debates, he has expressed the skepticism in perhaps the strongest form. Here's a piece from his essay in The Atlantic in 2019, the title of which was The Anthropocene is a Joke. He writes, perhaps someday our signal in the rocks will be found, but only if eagle-eyed stratigraphers from God knows where on the tree of life crisscross their own rearranged earth, assiduously trying to find us. But they would be unlikely to be rewarded for their effort. At the end of all their travels, after cataloging all the bedrock of the entire planet, they might finally be led to an odd razor-thin stratum hiding halfway up some eroding, far-flung desert canyon. If they then somehow found an accompanying plaque left behind by humanity that purports to assign this unusual layer its own epoch, sandwiched in these cliffs and embarrassed above and below by gigantic edifices of limestone, siltstone, and shale, this claim would amount to evidence of little more than our own species' astounding anthropocentrism. So for Brannon and others who share his skepticism, the very claim of the Anthropocene is further evidence of our profound hubris, reflecting our inflated sense of our own significance for and influence on the unimaginably long expanse of the future. So I'm not a geologist. I don't feel like I can weigh in on the scientific debates about how likely our traces are to last in a way that's discernible millions of years in the future. But the structure of these debates has some interesting features. First, insofar as it involves imagining a distant post-human future, the rhetoric of the Anthropocene is very much in line with our ubiquitous popular imaginary about pending environmental apocalypse. This is a topic I've discussed quite a lot elsewhere, but won't go into in detail here. The second, this Anthropocene is not something scientists have discovered. It's something they're trying to produce evidence for, kind of like prosecutors at a trial. And because of that, the Anthropocene in the scientific sense doesn't really seem much like science at all. It seems more like politics, like activism. Paul Crutzen, who's credited with coining the term or making it popular, rather, and other Earth system scientists who promoted this idea, they're often explicit that their aim is, in Crutzen's words, to provide a wake-up call about the self-destructive actions of our species. And so from this perspective, the supposedly scientific version of the Anthropocene begins to look more like kind of pseudo-scientific sleight of hand. It's presenting a putative factual prediction about the future as justification for a political agenda today. And to be clear, I have nothing against environmental activism, but I am concerned when it dresses itself up as an empirical discovery, as a scientific fact. And I do think that this costume accounts for a lot of the attention that the notion of the Anthropocene has received. And I would just say that there's a longer history of parallel attempts by scientists to influence public opinion by promoting political positions as if they were scientific claims. So for example, I think this has been the case with the so-called biodiversity crisis. I've written about that with some colleagues a few years back, but I think the invention of the Anthropocene is an even bolder move. So just to sum up then, my reservations about the Anthropocene are fourfold. First, the way that it seems to blame environmental harms on humanity or human nature in a way that obscures and naturalizes capitalist and colonial violence. Second, the questionable empirical basis for its predictions about our future fossils. Third, the apocalyptic structure of this narrative about future paleontologists. And fourth, the worry that its activism masquerading as science in a way that is intended to bypass transparent political debate. Now, despite these worries, I do think the Anthropocene, that this debate has brought a very important issue to the fore, one that deserves further investigation. And that is more specifically how the time of our lives relates to deep geological time, both past and future. And the scholar who's done the most to bring this issue to the foreground is Dipesh Chakrabarty. His widely cited 2009 essay, The Climate of History, 4 Theses, introduced the idea that anthropogenic climate change implies the collapse of the distinction between natural history and human history. And he's developed these ideas further in subsequent essays, culminating in his book published last year with Chicago, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. So there he argues that critiques of capitalism and globalization can't tell the whole story because they are limited to the perspective of human history, to what he calls the global perspective. To this, he contrasts the planetary perspective adopted by Earth system scientists, which is concerned not with human history, but with deep geological time. So for Chakrabarty, none of this is to deny what postcolonial critique has demonstrated concerning differential contributions to global problems. But the challenge, as he frames it, is precisely, in his words, to mix together the immiscible chronologies of capital and species history. So as I read him, his intent then is to defang the criticisms levied against the Anthropocene concept for its failure to account for the role of capital and colonialism in creating our current conditions, because he says those criticisms are still enclosed within the global and human perspective. They really have no bearing on the planetary perspective that now interrupts our lives from what he calls an absolute outside. Now, Chakrabarty introduces a number of interesting formulations to identify this temporal incongruence. So he says, for example, the fact that humans have become geological agents collapses the distance between the two calendars, namely geological time and the chronology of human histories. And so consequently, in his words again, the geologic now of the Anthropocene has become entangled with the now of human history. Or once again, he says, the wall between human and natural history has been breached. Now, this framing puts the relationship between human and geological time at the center of what we need to learn from the Anthropocene as two temporal registers, histories, calendars, or chronologies that have become fused, collapsed, entangled, or breached. These are all formulations that Chakrabarty uses. And the problem that he poses is therefore he says, how to encounter together planetary and global forms of thinking that are disparate yet intertwined, and that refer, he says, to vastly different and incommensurable scales of time. So for Chakrabarty, then, the stakes here also concern how we're to understand humanity as a form of life and in relation to other forms of life. So he's responding to those critics of the language of the Anthropocene who see it blaming environmental destruction on the human species. But for Chakrabarty, these references to the human species by proponents of the Anthropocene are justified from the perspective of deep history and planetary thinking, even if they're not justified from the perspective of human history, with its emphasis on the global and on critiques of capital. So he defends this language of the human species, if only, as he puts it, as a placeholder for an emergent new universal history of humans that flashes up in the moment of danger, that is climate change. Tarrying with the language of species in this way opens, he believes, a perspective on what he calls the extra-historical conditions for the existence of life in the human form and for our relation with the history of life on the planet. So to be clear, Chakrabarty does not claim to have solved this problem of mixing the immiscible or of fusing global and planetary thinking with their incommensurable scales of time. He really limits himself to posing the problem in these terms, which is a way of keeping both the global and the planetary perspectives on the table. But he does rule out certain kinds of solutions. And in particular, he rules out the possibility of any contribution from phenomenology. And that's because, in his view, geological history and the planetary perspective are essentially inaccessible to direct human experience. Furthermore, as it's approached through Earth system science, our planet, he says, is an object of astronomical and geological studies. It's really just one planet alongside other planets. So it's never really our planet. Instead, from this perspective, it's just a planet seen from the outside. It's a planet, he says, that confronts us with vast processes of unhuman dimensions and with radical otherness. These are his expressions. So he emphasizes that what he means by the planet is not to be confused with the figure of the Earth in phenomenologists like Husserl and Heidegger, because their accounts continue to include essential references to the human and human perspectives. So, in short, the geological and the planetary have displaced the phenomenological Earth, since our Earth remains on the worldly, human, and historical register, unable to account for the true alterity of the planetary. Now, it seems to me that Chakrabarty's strategy here is profoundly indebted to Quentin Meillassoux' speculative realism. And in fact, he cites Meillassoux approvingly in the midst of the conversation that I am reconstructing for you. So it's well known that Meillassoux in After Finitude criticizes what he calls the correlationism of phenomenology, which he claims encloses phenomenology within a subjective perspective. He argues that this leaves phenomenology incapable of accounting for or even accepting the existence of a time before or after human existence on the planet. And it prevents phenomenology from ever escaping the confines of its subjective prison in order to encounter what he calls the great outside being what does not submit to correlation with subjectivity. So it seems to me that Chakrabarty basically adopts this logic and adapts it to his own concepts. So for him, the correlation becomes the global world, essentially bound up with human history, while the planet becomes the great outside that vastly exceeds our myopic temporal and cognitive perspectives. And as you might already be able to tell, I don't find Maya Su's criticisms of phenomenology compelling. And I've discussed my reasons for that elsewhere, but I also don't think this logic takes us very far in the way that Chakrabarty has appropriated it here. So now I'm going to try to complicate this way of framing the question of deep time, after which I'll also bring us back to the question of the contributions that phenomenology might make. So to start, we should recognize that the framing of the issue as a collapse or a breaching of human and natural history, understood as two distinct chronologies, this is a vast oversimplification. And the simplification, I think, follows from Chakrabarty's starting point, which really concerns the limits of what is counted as history by academic historians. He's trained in the discipline of history. But then the breaching or the collapsing that he's talking about here only really concerns scholarly constructions of temporal narratives, not how we encounter time, nor how time unfolds in the world. In fact, it makes little sense to say that we are somehow inside human history, but outside natural history, not only because of the questionable metaphors of containment, but also because our temporal involvement is not a simple binarism. Instead, we're always enmeshed within innumerable temporal scales, and at the confluence of various intersecting temporal happenings. For example, my experience of time at this moment, or this week, or this year, the time of my life as a whole, and of the lives of those with whom my life overlaps, the known history of my family tree, human written history and unwritten prehistory, the span of organic evolution all the way back to life's earliest common ancestor, geological time encompassing the entire history of the planet, cosmic time since the Big Bang. In short, we're moments of passage and moments of becoming for innumerable overlapping and intersecting temporal happenings. And these happenings are not punctual nor discrete, they're mutually implicated. So one thinker who's sometimes provides some inspiration in thinking these things through is Alfred North Whitehead, who makes some suggestive remarks on the concept of nature, about how these temporal happenings at different scales hang together as a whole. And so he writes there, the passage of nature, which is only another name for the creative force of existence, has no narrow ledge of definite instantaneous present within which to operate. Its operative presence, which is now urging nature forward, must be sought for throughout the whole, in the remotest past, as well as in the narrowest breadth of any present duration, perhaps also in the unrealized future. Now, commenting on this text from Whitehead, French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty proposes that we understand nature as, in his expression, the memory of the world. And by this, he wants to convey that our experience of time, or our engagement with time, is corporeal and visceral as much as it is cognitive. Both the reflective and the unreflective ways that we live time are a consequence of our embeddedness in the passage of nature as temporal pulses within its full fabric. So the memory of the world, the entire span of nature's passage, is constitutive of our experience of time. And if that's true, we don't need to build a bridge between lived time and geological time, because there have never been any barriers between them to breach. So deep time then is not split off from lived and historical time. And one implication of this is that deep time is itself essentially historical. It isn't simply a mathematical extrapolation of clock time. And in thinking through this historical character of deep time, my account is indebted to the recent work of Jerome Miller in the context of what he calls robust evolution. So clock time, or time as a variant in scientific equations, consists of an invariant standard units that are repeatable. And as standard units, any one moment can be substituted for any other moment. But in historical time, By contrast, past, present, and future are irreducibly heterogeneous, and this is why each moment is unique and datable. It follows that the future is not simply the next repetition of an invariant temporal atom. It's not reducible to another present. In Miller's words, the future is essentially unlike what precedes it. It is unprecedented. For it to be the future, it must be essentially heterogeneous from the present. And as he puts it, always already breaking the present open to possibilities that cannot be assimilated into it. So Miller refers to this as the traumatological character of historical time, which is its inherent capacity to undo, to rupture. In other words, the future as such always risks disrupting or undoing what the present carries within itself from the past. So the future is the permanent risk of loss of the world's memory, even as that memory constitutes every unique and singular present. Now, clock time, on the other hand, is precisely a strategy for managing this world-shattering potential of the future, which it attempts by assimilating this future as merely one more present in a homogeneous series of presents. Elsewhere, I've suggested that we can see a similar strategy for managing the risk of the future as such in many sustainability projects that take as their aim sustaining the past unchanged into the future. Now, I'd like to make these ideas more concrete by returning to Chakrabarty's claims about how the human species relates to the history of life. Life has often been understood as kind of organic memory. So, for example, Elizabeth Gross, taking inspiration from Bergson, writes that, quote, life, even the simplest organic cell, carries its past within its present as no material object does. And today, the most straightforward way of understanding this notion of organic memory is undoubtedly through the genetics of evolutionary descent. So, for example, evolutionary biologist George Williams writes that, quote, the generation of diversity by cladogenesis, that is the differentiation of the phylogenetic tree, furnishes every population with a unique set of historical legacies. In this sense, an organism is a living record of its own history. Now, so far so good, but I also think we can enrich this understanding of organic memory immensely by approaching life in diacritical terms. So Merleau-Ponty introduces the notion of diacritical difference, first of all, to describe language as a system consisting only of differences without positive terms. He writes in the context of a discussion of Saussure, he says, what we've learned from Saussure is that taken singly, signs do not signify anything, and that each one of them does not so much express a meaning as mark a divergence of meaning between itself and other signs. Since the same can be said for all other signs, we may conclude that language is made up of differences without terms, or more exactly, that the terms of language are engendered only by the differences which appear among them. So to describe the unity of language, then, he compares it to the way that stones press against one another to hold up an arch. The arch itself is nothing but the differential forces of the stones. So the idea here is that differential relations are more basic than their relata. And Merleau-Ponty locates the expressive potential of language in this differentiating activity, in the intervals and interruptions of differential relations. What we usually think of as the components of language, words, syllables, phonemes, these are really positive byproducts of the more fundamental active power of differentiating. Now, what interests me here is that Merleau-Ponty later extends this conception of diacritical difference to life. And this is how he puts it in his final lecture courses on nature. Life is not a separable thing, but an investment, a singular point, a hollow in being, an invariant ontological relief, the establishment of a level around which the divergences begin forming, a kind of being that functions like an arch. But life is not negativity. It is a pattern of negations, a system of opposition that means that what is not this is that. So we see here again the example of the arch, the stones that hold each other up without external support. And the suggestion is that life, in parallel with language, is a creative and expressive system of differences rather than a collection of things or positive terms. And I call this view bio-diacritics. And elsewhere, I've suggested that it has advantages for understanding the diversity of life over the received scientific concept of biodiversity. But now let's consider how this bio-diacritical perspective can contribute to understanding life as a memory in a way that goes beyond genetic inheritance. It might be a cliche example nowadays, but I'd like to start with a classic from Richard Dawkins back in 1993, where he famously illustrated the evolutionary continuity between humans and chimpanzees. I wish I could find a good slide illustrating this, but we'll have to make do. So Dawkins suggests that we imagine holding the hand of our mother while she holds the hand of her mother, and she holds the hand of her mother in a long continuous line. Imagine that we allow about a yard for each individual, and we trace the path of this line into the evolutionary past about 300 miles. At this point, our ancestor would reach out her other hand to grasp the hand of her other child. And that child will hold the hand of her child, who holds the hand of her child in a new line that retraces each generation back toward the present. So if these two lines form facing each other, then when the second line completes itself in the present day, we'll find ourselves linked through a continuous connection of hands to our nearest evolutionary relation, the modern chimpanzee, with whom we stand face to face. Now, this thought experiment does an impressive job of helping us picture our evolutionary kinship with our nearest non-human relatives. And it can be extended further into the past to illustrate our common ancestry with invertebrates or even with plants. I once heard the philosopher Peter Steeves from DePaul do just that in a presentation, although I don't think he's published that paper. But part of what I want you to see is that this image, as provocative as it is, it's still tied to kinship by descent and filiation. So it doesn't yet bring us to a bio-diacritical perspective. For that, we would need to recognize that each individual along the chain, along every line of evolutionary descent, is what it is only through the myriad relationships that shape its mode of life, which would include, for example, what it eats and what eats it, what it competes with for food, the parasites, microbes, and viruses that colonize it, the trees that provide it shelter, the microbial associations that allow those trees to grow, the landscape that offers those trees an opportunity to seed, and even the landforms and hydrology, the soil and the climate, and all the geological conditions that those relationships require. If we understand bio-diacritics as a system of differences without positive terms, if we think that in terms of the full network of relations that make any continuity of life possible, then we would have to say that every living organism is the diacritical memory of all of these relationships in pleats and in folds that span the full duration of evolutionary time. So as we said about language, every node of organic difference, from genes to organisms to species, exists precisely as the immanently articulated difference from all others, including the patterns and investments through which it's taken form over the course of evolutionary time. So to be a living creature then is necessarily to be the embodied memory of an entire evolutionary history of expressive divergences. And what makes extinction a singular loss then is that it erases any continuation for this diacritical memory. Given what we've said about the traumatological character of the future, extinction is always a standing risk for any form of life. Now, what I'm hoping to show with this extended example is that neither human history nor deep time Chakrabarty's two calendars. Neither of those can be represented by discrete linear chronologies. Instead, we endure innumerable temporalities and mutual implication. A philosopher, Michel Serres, has actually suggested that we abandon the linear perspective of time altogether in favor of something topological, like pleated or crumpled time, for example. If we think time is crumpled, then that allows us to recognize the ways that moments we think of as separated by a thickness of past and future can in fact be in close relation. What we think of as close can be far, can be distant, and what we think of as distant can in fact be close. So in Michel Serres' words, he says, time is an extraordinarily complex mixture, as though it reflected stopping points, ruptures, deep wells, chimneys of thunderous acceleration, rendings, gaps, all sown at random. And so, to be clear, I'm not speaking here only of our subjective experience of time, although I think we can offer phenomenological examples of all of these complex relations, but also of our visceral immersion in the temporal flows that form and reform us, flows or interruptions that condition any possible subjective experience of time. These multiple pleated and entangled flows of time reverberate through our bodies, and our explicit awareness of time is formed against the background of this corporeal participation in the memory of the world. Michel Serres, once again, provocatively suggests that we consider each and every living thing to be a memory, an inert or asubjective memory that awaits translation into active remembrance. As he puts it, insofar as I am memory, I participate in things. Insofar as they are things, they have memory. And so to conclude then, coming to the end of our time, and I'm coming to the end of my remarks, I want to return to Chakrabarty's planetary perspective, which is not so much false, in my opinion, as forgetful, because it takes for granted the perceptual and temporal relationships that every one of us maintains with the singular Earth. Merleau-Ponty summarizes the point as follows. Truth of perception. There was no objectivity without a point of view in itself. An observer is necessary with his levels, his soil, his homeland, his perceptual norms, in short, his Earth, which is not fixed in the sense of the pre-Copernicans, but not simply a moving object within a system of relative movements. So here in this lecture course, Institution and Passivity lecture course, Merleau-Ponty is clearly referring to Husserl's famous short fragment, Foundational Investigations on the Philosophy of Nature. And in that short fragment, Husserl claims that Earth, in the originary sense, is earth ground, as the ground against which all motion and rest become possible. That Earth, in that sense, cannot be said to move. Now, this primordial sense of Earth has been displaced, of course, by our modern notion of the Earth as one relative moving body among others, that is, precisely as one planet among others. But this new sense is an accomplishment with a history, one that remains essentially conditioned by Earth's originary spatiality and temporality. And so, in short, from Husserl's point of view, the planetary would be meaningless without the Earth as our unique Earth ground. Commenting on Husserl in his final course, The Possibility of Philosophy Today, Merleau-Ponty writes the following: show that access to other planets does not relativize the Earth and does not make a Körper out of the others, but on the contrary, that such access extends to other planets the function of a pre-objective Boden of a soil. The other planets become annexes of the Earth, or the Earth expands, but one is always someplace. Now, as I noted in passing, Chakrabarty holds that Husserl's account of the Earth as experiential ground is challenged by the Anthropocene. Since the unity of the Earth for Husserl arises, in Husserl's words, out of the unity of all humanity, unquote, it falls short of the inhuman perspective of the planetary. Chakrabarty takes this unity of humanity in Husserl as a return to subjective correlation, and that would then close us off from the true alterity of the planet. But there's another way to interpret Husserl's claim, and Merleau-Ponty points us in this direction when he writes that in Merleau-Ponty's words, the foundation of the unity of history is the uniqueness of the earth. Rather than the unity of earth being a correlate of subjectivity, then, the earth shares a mutually implicatory relation with our flesh as the very ground of space and time. Now, Merleau-Ponty admits that Husserl doesn't follow through on this insight, and maybe that's why Merleau-Ponty turns from Husserl's earth to Whitehead's account of our temporal implication in the passage of nature. Whitehead actually makes this explicit as a relation of mutual immanence with nature. And he even refers to this as a chiasmus. He writes, "We are in the world and the world is in us," very Merleau-Pontian expression. Now, this does not describe, in my view, an anthropomorphizing correlation, but instead the lived basis for our engagement with incommensurable and asubjective temporalities. And in this case, the unity of humanity and of all earthly life would rest on the uniqueness of the earth, not as a scientific representation, but as the memory that is constitutive of our being from within. The emergent universal history of life that Chakrabarty seeks would then be found in our mutual implication in the unique history of the earth, since that is what makes us all earthlings. So my aim here has been to open the door to a phenomenology of deep time that would account for the multiple crumpled scales of time that play across us as material and living beings. And this is certainly a messier picture of our relation to time than Chakrabarty's simple diptych of global and planetary calendars that are breached by the Anthropocene. I don't really see how this distinction between global and planetary enriches our understanding of our relation to deep time. And consequently, I don't see how it can serve to defend the autonomy of Earth system science, or really to deflect the criticisms of the idea of the Anthropocene. But I think phenomenology suggests a more fruitful path, as when Husserl describes the world as the horizon of horizons, the ultimate horizon that embraces all possible horizons, because that allows us to then consider the Earth as the temporal horizon of horizons, as the ontological memory, and in equal measures, the ontological forgetting that embodies all possible geological pasts and futures. Nothing guarantees that we have left our mark as an immortal trace in rock, whether we find in that dream a source of secret pride or a cause for shame. What we can know is that the entire history of the Earth expresses itself through every unique moment in time's constellation, that what we have in common is this shared memory, and that every future risks its ruin. None of this relieves our responsibilities to nature and to each other, but perhaps it provides a perspective from which we can appreciate the creative ferment of differences that the world's memory brings to bear on the present and the future, and how this immemorial past binds us to our fellow earthlings. Thank you for your time. I don't know if I'm feeling my own questions or if others.
No, okay. Is it okay if I go ahead, Ted?
Please go ahead, yes.
Okay, right. Thanks a lot. That was really interesting. I'm a geologist, and I have to sort of wrap my head around a little bit of what you said and how you said it, because it's extremely interesting, but I think I'd have to give it some thought. But a couple of things that occurred to me. I don't think that. So you don't really like the idea of the Anthropocene very much, and I understand your arguments, but I don't think one should reject it just because it has political overtones. I think from a geological perspective, it's pretty clear that man has impacted the environment as a geological life force. I mean, we've changed the atmosphere, we've changed the chemistry of the oceans, and if you looked at the land's surface, we've completely altered it in almost every continent. So we've extracted geological materials. We've changed its distribution of things. If you were to come here in a million years and look for fossil fuels, you'd be amazed at how much of that part of geologic time was missing because we've extracted it. So I do think that we have fundamentally changed the Earth in a way that would be recognizable to somebody who is coming and viewing us in a million years or several million years time scale. Now the question is, I think, whether or not that would be something that would be just a moment in time, or whether it would be something that really is marking a change in the state of the Earth system, and that I can't be sure about, and that's where I think that this interesting discussion of time comes in, because we as human beings have a very, very difficult time fathoming geologic time. A million years is a remarkable amount of time. And if we start talking about a billion years, we're just talking about scales of time and changes in the Earth, which are almost impossible, I think, for the human mind to comprehend. So anyway, I don't know if that takes us anywhere, but maybe back to the idea of the Anthropocene. I do believe that we are changing the Earth in ways that would be recognizable. Whether those would be long-term state changes in the Earth system, I can't be sure.
Okay, yes, thank you for that. I don't disagree at all. I think we are clearly changing Earth systems. And you know, we could, and I'm not a geologist and you are, so you know, you are in a better position to evaluate the claims that people are making about how legible this will be in a million years. Although I will just say that the points I've read from critics are, you know, they're hard for me to dismiss very quickly. They say things like, you know, if, for example, we consider all the extinctions that we have caused, in the geological record, there would be no way to determine that we were the cause of these extinctions any more than just being one of them that happened over the span of, say, the last 100,000 years. There won't be anything fine-tuned enough for anyone a million years from now to say, oh, here's what caused these extinctions. And you know, as you say, we've pumped out a lot of fossil fuels, and in a certain sense, then we've altered what remains in the record. But of course, there are huge gaps in the geological record that we have no. I mean, did aliens come and suck out a whole bunch of resources 500 million years ago in order to leave gaps? We have no basis for concluding that. But this isn't the point, of course, I want to make, and this I think is your point too, is that we're not really debating geology when we find ourselves invested in these questions. What we're really debating is what we're doing and what our responsibility for it is. We're trying to hold each other accountable. And I think there are better ways to hold each other accountable than to disguise it as a question about what, you know, paleontologists from another planet will find here in a million years. Why don't we instead just have the conversation face to face now and debate it about what we see as our responsibilities, what kind of role we want to live in now, what kind of role we want to leave behind for other living creatures, ourselves and others. And I think we can get a little bit too fixated on this idea of our own continuity. So I recently read an interview with Jane Bennett, whose work I have admired, who said what the debates about the Anthropocene are all really about is the human species continuing. And I find that really shocking. I don't agree with that. I mean, species come and species go, and I think we should reconcile ourselves to the fact that a billion years from now, we're not going to be here, or if we have, at what costs would that bring? I don't feel a deep, effective commitment to humans lasting forever. And I think that's part of what kind of is at stake effectively in some of these debates. I think we should try to focus in, clarify for ourselves what the values are that we're really committed to, and discuss them openly in open discussion and debate. And that those won't be decisions to be made by the by international stratigraphers about how we name our geological epoch. So I'm going on too long. I'll stop there and see if there are other questions.
Maybe while we're waiting, I could continue a little bit. I understand that the Anthropocene has been co-opted as a term. In fact, it's very similar to Vernadsky's Noocene. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept. He introduced this in the 1930s, I suppose, or something like that. And as a geologist, I don't really care so much about the political nuances of the Anthropocene. What I just see is that humans are a geological force on a global scale, and I'm sure that will be something that will impact the geologic record, if you want to view it that way. I mean, it would be impossible, I think, for future explorers to come and not observe the buildings and the roads and the debris and stuff that we have left behind, and sort of make the case that this stuff has been derived from these gaps in the geologic record that you talked about.
As to the factual prediction, I have to admit I have no expertise in that. I think what you say makes a lot of sense. We're leaving a lot of stuff behind, but 500 million years is a long time. And once all the continents have been ground up and, molten and spewed back out again, and what's left of us is a little tiny, chemical layer in the bottom of some ocean somewhere. I don't know how legible or reconstructible it'll be, but I have no expertise on that. My question is really, why are we so, what is it we're really invested in this debate? Why have humanists and social scientists and others found this geological distinction to be where they want to invest their time and energies? And I don't think we're really talking about that when we make it a matter of discussion about what geologists will be able to trace in the future. I don't disagree with you at all that we are altering planetary systems. Of course, microbes altered the planet considerably at various stages, and the reason why we have oxygen, on the planet is because living things altered it dramatically, right? So it isn't as if humans are the first living things to ever change planetary systems. Other living things have done that and continue to do that. And it would be a bit self-aggrandizing to tell ourselves that we are the masters, the architects of the planet, rather than that microbes are. We won't last long without them. They have altered it, in profound ways that we would have no way to reproduce if they all vanished. And so I think it makes a lot more sense to just recognize that living things are in it together. This is a point that other people have made well. And so, why aren't we in the microbial scene rather than the Anthropocene? I think the fact that we want to pull ourselves out and say, we are the dominant force on the planet. Why aren't plants the dominant force on the planet? I mean, I haven't really ever heard an argument for or against these different positions, but, plenty of people developing, people spinning out different ways that the world will collapse have certainly imagined what's going to happen to us if the sky goes dark and there are no more, there's no more photosynthesis, and we don't come out very well. So all I'm saying is I'm not disagreeing that we've transformed global systems, but I think that there are subtleties about the ways that this argument gets made in Anthropocene debates that we're not really paying attention to, and a lot turns on how we think about these distinctions.
Anna, can you just unmute your computer, and Veronica, you can go over there. Wait 1 second.
Oh. No. I know. Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. And I'm not sure I understood the concept of this phenomenology of deep time that you are proposing. I think because on the one hand, it's like a middle point between like more this chain between like the retention and pretension from the Husserl model, but also there is some rhizomatic aspect in it. And I'm asking more about this because I think there is a political implicance in this deep time phenomenology, because what do we thematize in each point of this process, of this not linear, but now like moving time?
Okay, well, thank you. It's a huge question. And I will not pretend that I have worked out all the aspects of a phenomenology of deep time. And what I'm really hoping to accomplish more than anything is to show that starting the conversation as a phenomenologist does not exclude us from entering into a phenomenological investigation of deep time. And I think that has been an assumption made by phenomenologists, perhaps, but certainly made by the critics of phenomenology, most stridently by Maya Su and now Chakrabarty and others. I would say, first of all, deep time is not just numbers on a line. We encounter deep time viscerally. And in other places, I've talked, for example, about James Hutton taking his friends to Sycamore Point in Scotland to show them what's become known as Hutton's unconformity, to make the case for the age of geological time. And his friends talked about the affective sense of looking into the abyss of time. It seems to me that when you go to the museum and you hold in your hand a fossil from 500 million years ago, you encounter it as you encounter the unfathomable, unrepresentable antiquity of it in a visceral and affective way. And I don't think, so I have no criticisms of the phenomenology of time consciousness that talks about the tripartite aspects of the thick present, right? Protensions and retentions. I'm not disagreeing with any of that, but I'm saying that that is only the starting point for thinking about the structure of lived time, and our actual experiences of the entangled times that we live open us onto the times of our parents, our ancestors. There are expressions that I use that I know I got from my parents, and that I can be almost certain came to them from their parents. And how many generations back do these things go? The very language that I speak, of course, preceded me. I take it up as an enfolded memory, cultural memory that's been passed along and that gets transformed and develops over time. I'm embedded in, entangled in all kinds of temporal events that precede me and will outlast me. And so we have to complicate our understanding of the lived experience of time to account for this foldedness of time. When I say foldedness, of course, I get that topological idea from Michel Serres, but I think it is phenomenologically very compelling. There are moments from my past, maybe even my early past, that continue to exert more of an influence on my present than what happened 10 minutes ago or an hour ago. And there are moments of the future that I am drawn toward, oriented toward, polarized by, that, affect me a lot more than what's going to happen a day from now. And so I live in this folded time. And part of what might be misleading when we look at this kind of classic chart of protensions and retentions is it can give the suggestion that, What's closer is what is sort of closer to its influence on the now. And the farther that things spread out, toward past and future, the less relevant they are. That's not the case. So I just want to say that, so you part of your point is, what are the politics of this rhizomatic aspect of time? And the only aspect of that I really try to get at right now is, I mean, I guess I have told you explicitly, I think the politics of Chakrabarty's invention are undone by a more complex account of time. And I would also say, I explored this elsewhere, that I think our apocalyptic thinking about the environment, and more generally, we live in a time where our imaginaries have been captured by apocalyptic thinking. And I think a better appreciation of our entanglement in these different temporalities can help us see why that is a kind of tunnel vision that we should be very suspicious of. But apart from that, I can't say that I have a fuller answer to the question of the politics of this more rhizomatic aspect of time. I think there's still a lot to be explored. I just really want to open phenomenologists to thinking about our involvement, our embeddedness, not only in the deep past, but also in the deep future.